Hey guys, just wanted to go over the questions from the packet. So if we're looking at question number 1, I want you to notice that it's talking about abiotic factors. Again, abiotic factors are non-living. So if they're asking for the abiotic factors that affect the growth of a plant, or the growth of grass, you can get rid of bacteria because that's living, earthworms because that's living, and decomposers because that's living. So the answer should have been number 3. Now, for number 2, it's actually going to be the opposite because if we're looking at a biotic factors are living. So if you take a look on the opposite end, temperature is non-living, salt is non-living, and pH is non-living, which would give us 1 as the correct answer. Number 3, which statement regarding the ecosystem shown in the diagram below is correct? So they're going to give us a bunch of statements and we have to analyze the picture. So the community within the ecosystem consists of 7 guppies and 1 catfish. Now a community is all of the living things. So if you notice here, they are missing the snails, which makes number 1 not correct. Number 2, the energy source for this ecosystem is the gas. Your energy has to be some sort of a light. So we have our light bar over there. A population within this ecosystem is the 3 snails. This is the correct answer because a population is a group of the same species living in the same area. And then number 4, cycling of materials is not necessary in this self-sustaining ecosystem. If you have a self-sustaining ecosystem, you have to be able to recycle the materials. So number 4 is coming down to what is the definition of a population? Again, a population is a group of the same species living in the same area. So the correct answer should have been number 1 because we're talking about one species living in one area. For number 2, all of the plants is too much. The living and the non-living, that would be an ecosystem in and of itself, and all of Earth, so a little bit too big. Number 5, when 2 bird species temporarily occupy the same niche, if you have the same niche, we're thinking about competition. If you have the same niche, you're fighting for food, you're fighting for space, you're fighting for resources. So right there, I know that the answer has to be number 1. You can't interbreed 2 different bird species. Obviously, if they're the same niche, they're not going to have no effect on each other. And number 1 just doesn't make sense. Number 6, again, we have our ecosystem, and they're saying a community. Again, a community is all of the living things in the ecosystem. It doesn't have any abiotic factors, so you can get rid of gravel, water, and 4, which would leave us with choice number 3. Number 7, the diagram below shows organisms in and around a pond. So again, if we're talking about all the organisms in the diagram, all the organisms, all the living things, that is the definition of a community. A heterotroph is an organism that's not able to make its own food. And obviously we have plants here, so that wouldn't work. Producer is the opposite. They are able to make their own food. We have organisms that cannot. And then again, population is a group of one species, and we have numerous species here. Number 8, researchers have reported that the number of different species of fish found in certain area of the ocean has been greatly reduced. So we're reducing the amount of different types of fish. So if you're reducing the amounts of different types of fish, you're obviously losing biodiversity. Now, number 3 makes no sense because differentiation is the specialization of cells. Carrying capacity we haven't spoken about just yet. And 2, ecological succession, again, doesn't have to deal with the amount of organisms here. Number 9, so we have 2 different species of a single-celled organism that eat the same food. So if we're eating the same food, we're going to be having competition. Typically, if you're eating the same food, you're going to occupy the same niche. So they are placed in the same container. A constant food supply was provided starting on day 2. You can notice here's on day 2. And the populations were monitored daily. The graph below represents the 2 populations. We can see here that this one definitely did better than that one. So which statement here goes along with that idea? So the most likely reason for the observed changes in the populations should have been P. aurelia outcompeted P. caudatum. So number one is the opposite of that. Three, if they had shared the resources, they would have kind of leveled out. They both would have probably been around the same area. So that's why that would not be correct. And it's definitely not a predator because they were eating the same food. So number 10, in a pine forest, there are different species of birds known as warblers that are able to coexist on the same pine tree. So if they can coexist, they're not competing with another. So therefore, they're going to be in a different niche. The Cape May warblers feed on insects located on the top of the highest pine trees, and the yellow rumped warblers feed on the insects on the lower branches of the same trees. So they live in the same area, but if you had a tree, one's going to be living on the top up here and the other's living down there, and they're eating different types of foods. So the different feeding and locations of these birds indicate that they have different niches. They obviously live in the same ecosystem if they're living in the same tree. It has nothing to do with sexual or asexual reproduction, and selective breeding is actually done by humans looking for specific traits. Number 11, the science of ecology is best defined as the study of. So here we're just looking for the definition of ecology. So if that's the case, it's the interaction of the living or the biotic and non-living abiotic factors. So classification, this is actually taxonomy, which again, we haven't spoken about yet. Technology has nothing to do with ecology. And then the weather, that is more of an earth science concept. Number 12, base your answer to the following question on the information below and your knowledge of biology. Lichens. When I see the word lichen, I'm automatically thinking about a pioneer species. I'm thinking about ecological succession. Are composed of two organisms, a fungus that cannot make its own food, and an algae that contains chlorophyll. If it contains chlorophyll, it has the ability to do photosynthesis and therefore make its own food. Lichens may live on the bark of trees or even bare rock. They secrete acids that tend to break up the rock they live on, helping to produce soil. As soil accumulates from the broken rock and dead lichens, other organisms, such as plants, begin to grow. The ability of the lichens to alter their environment, enabling other organisms to grow and take their places in that environment, is one step in, and here we go, ecological succession. Now, again, ecological succession is similar to biological evolution. Evolution is the change in a species over time, where ecological succession is the change in land over time. We're not talking about cells. That just doesn't make sense. And again, differentiation is the ability of a cell to become specialized. For number 13, base your answer to the following question on the diagrams below and your knowledge of biology. The diagram represents events that occurred during succession in a pond. So succession, we know that we're changing the land or changing what is growing there over time. And you can see that it definitely does change. We have A, B, C, D. So it was a pond over at A. At C, it looks like it was completely forest. And then D, it looks like it's sort of going back to a little bit of a pond. So the major factor, determining the final stage in the succession is the what. So it would be the climate, because if you have a climate change, it's going to change what it is going to become. So here, it should have gone back to a pond completely, but it did not. You can see that the sediment is all right there. Number 14, I'm going to see if I can zoom out on this a little bit, just so we can see the whole thing. Let me see. Let me take a look. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So number 14, the diagram below represents varying biodiversity in three ecosystems. If you take a look at each stage, we have stage 1, we have stage 2. So here's 1, 2, 3, and 4. In ecosystem 1, we are constantly having more organisms in each stage. So if we take a look at that, the level of biodiversity in ecosystem A is high because of what? It's high because it has more organisms. So number 1, the least variety of energy levels, they're all 4 energy levels. So that's not going to change. the greatest variety of genetic material. If you have the most organisms, you have the most genetic material. You can't say 3, the greatest number of decomposers, because if you look here and here, there's the same amount of decomposers. And actually, that doesn't even have anything to deal with the total biodiversity. And then 4, at least number of ecological niches, that would make sense if it has the most organisms. And here's last but not least, when I see this picture, automatically in my head, I'm thinking about ecological succession. I don't know if the question is going to be dealing with that at all. But it does say if the oak and hickory trees were burned in a forest fire. So here's oak and hickory. If they were burned in a forest fire, leaving bare soil, so barren soil, going back to here, which group of plants would most likely be the first to grow back? So on this here, the first set to grow back is crabgrass and horseweed, which would be number 1.